So hi everyone, welcome to the next session for YA ThrillerCon. For this one, I'm joined by Jayme Mattler and Kit Frick, and this is the author and one of the narrators of the audiobook for I Killed Zoe Spanos. So firstly, Kit, would you like to introduce yourself and your book?
Yes, absolutely. Hi everyone. This is so fun. I'm so excited to be doing this. I'm joining you from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania today. I'm holding the paperback release. I don't know if there we go. I'm having a little trouble getting everything in the camera. The paperback release, which just came out. Unfortunately, I don't have a physical copy of the audiobook to hold up, but it's such an amazing audiobook. And so I'm so excited to be chatting with Jayme and Maddie about it today. And yeah, I'm the YA author of 3 published young adult thrillers. I have a 4th that's going to be coming out in 2022, and I'm excited to talk all things thrillers.
That is so exciting. Yeah, and Jayme, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I am Jayme Mattler, and I was one of the narrators on I Killed Zoe Spanos. As far as audiobook industry goes, I'm a recording engineer, director, narrator, producer. I've kind of done it all. And I had a great time working on this book.
Great. Yeah, like the first time when I came across your book, as soon as I heard the description of it, I knew that I needed to read it straight away. But it was also a time when like I was having a lot of medical appointments and I was doing a lot of traveling. So I was like, I'm going to get the audiobook. And yeah, so that was I think that was the first YA thriller I ever listened to like for the audiobook, because usually for audio I would like gravitate more towards nonfiction. So it was such like a fun experience listening to this audiobook. And with it being a YA thriller, like I was so gripped and like on the edge of my seat all the time. And just every time when I thought I knew like who the villain was, you just threw in another twist. And I was just like, I could not predict it at all. It was just like amazing. And yeah, having like the audiobook with like the different narrators, it just added this whole like extra dimension to sort of like the experience of like living in this book. So yeah, I'm really like curious, Kit, sort of what inspired you to write this book?
Yeah, well, I love first of all that they did this full cast narration for the audiobook, because there were 2 primary things that inspired it, and one was my love of podcasts. And I listen to a lot of podcasts, a lot of true crime podcasts, a lot of writing podcasts, sometimes cooking, news. I'm a really avid podcast listener. So when I heard that there would be this full cast narration that would bring the podcast element of the book to life, along with, so Jayme narrates, I hope I'm getting this right, the 3rd person narration. The book is divided into, there's a 1st person narrator who is Anna. There is a 3rd person narrator that begins in a sort of 3rd person general point of view, and then it moves into Martina's point of view as the story progresses. And then there are also the podcast transcripts that are interspersed in the narration. So I think there were 11, 12 possibly. Does that sound right? Folks involved in the narration?
I don't remember exactly how many. I know that it was myself, the woman who narrated Anna. Inez del Castillo was Martina on the podcast. And then there were a bunch of other people in there.
Yeah. So the podcast was a big inspiration, because I was thinking about the novel Rebecca, which is the other primary inspiration point for I Killed Zoe Spanos. And I was thinking about if that classic novel had taken place in, circa 2020 era, obviously not pandemic. That was not on my mind when I was writing it, but otherwise contemporary times. How might it have looked if this wealthy socialite woman, who is the titular character of Rebecca in Marley's novel, what would have happened if that woman went missing today? And the first thing I thought was, obviously there would be a true crime podcast about it. And so then I thought, okay, so if we have Rebecca set today, there's a true crime podcast, and now let's make it YA. And Rebecca is set in this affluent seaside suburb of London. So if I wanted to set that in the US, I was living in Brooklyn at the time, and I thought, well, the Hamptons, obviously, wealthy seaside suburb of New York City. So all those, once the setting locked into place, those were sort of the three hinge points that inspiration for the book hinge points that they hinged on. I don't know what I'm saying, but yeah. So Rebecca and the podcast and the setting of the Hamptons.
That's so cool, and I love hearing sort of like where your inspiration sort of like started, especially with Rebecca, because I really love it when you got sort of these new YA thrillers are based or like inspired by older stories, and you can really sort of see how just sort of changing the setting, changing the time frame, it introduces all these new elements that you can then play on, like especially when technology is involved. So yeah, anyway, Jayme, my next question is for you, and so how did you get involved as a narrator in this project, and what were your thoughts when you read the manuscript for the first time?
Like most audiobook narration contracts, somebody wrote me and said, "We have a book for you. Will you do it?" And I said, "Yes." You don't get a lot of information. You don't get the manuscript ahead of time. You get usually like sometimes you get an audition. I don't think I auditioned. I think that it was just offered to me. I'm sure that Kit can tell you what the casting process was like on her end. You probably got samples from people, and then you picked who you wanted for the main parts.
Yeah, they sent me, so Simon & Schuster Audio did the audiobook, and they sent me an email with their suggestions for the third person narrator, who is Jayme, for the voice of Anna, who is Jenny Barber, and the voice of Martina, who is Inez del Castillo. And then also J.C. Walensky does the voice of Aster Spanos. And then I'm looking back at this email, I think there were also 7 folks that form the ensemble cast. So they always send suggestions for past audiobooks. It varies a little bit from audiobook to audiobook. I basically could have vetoed, I think, anyone, but everyone was great. And so I said, yes, good job. Let's hire all these folks and do it.
Yeah. I mean, the producer's job is to sort of read through the book, get the vibe, and know the different narrators that are working and try to match the best people for the job. So, if you're happy, then they did a good job. So good job, Simon & Schuster. Yeah. So then I got the script and I read through it. I mean, I don't think about the book too much or judge it or even try to form an opinion on a book when I'm prepping. Like, prep is very technical for me. It's like, who are the players? Where are they from? How old are they? What are their, attitudinal descriptions, their physical descriptions? I just really want to get like a template going for like, what am I working with here? And then I worry about the rest of it once I'm in it. Once I'm in it, I want to experience it at the same time as the listener. I want to be surprised. I want to be confused. I want to be discovering and searching at the same time. So I know the basic plot, but I haven't really lived the book yet because I don't want it to feel dry when I get into the narration.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And I suppose when I'm writing something, if I outline it a lot, and then I have no motivation to actually write it because I feel like I've already written it in a way. So yeah, I suppose that's kind of like the equivalent thing, really, where you've got to sort of like be able to immerse yourself into the story and sort of live through that experience sort of as a first time then. So yeah, that totally makes sense. Yeah, so Kit, can you talk us through a bit of the writing process? Sort of like, what was it like writing the story? How long did it take? And did the story change much from the concept stage to the actual finished piece?
Yeah, I love talking about the writing process for this book because it was so smooth compared to some of my other novels. So I get to say like, oh, I wrote the first draft in about 3 months, and then not
Wow.
much changed. And, this is always how it is, which is very untrue. But I wrote the first draft, I think it was the spring to summer of 2018. So I started drafting maybe late spring. This was a option book for my publisher, which means that I'd had a previous contract. That contract had finished, and then my publisher had essentially right of first refusal on my next novel. So I had to submit, I think it was a summary and the first several chapters to my publisher, and then they could decide if they wanted to put in an offer or not. And that's basically how option contracts work. So I had written the first couple chapters, but then I just kept going. It was summer of 2018, and as happens over the summer in publishing, everyone goes on vacation at various times. And so these weekly or bi-weekly, whenever they normally happen, acquisitions meetings get bumped all the time in the summer because some key player is at a conference or on vacation or someone's sick or whatever. And so I kept getting notes from my editor saying, okay, I think next week it's going to acquisitions, like we're trying. So I just kept writing because the acquisitions meeting kept getting bumped. And so by the time the book actually sold to McElderry, the imprint at Simon & Schuster, where I'm published, I had written the complete first draft. And then, which was a good thing, because then they were like, okay, so can you have this to us next month? Which if I hadn't written it, the answer would have been no.
Yeah.
But I was able to revise and get some feedback from beta readers and get the first draft in. It went through 2 rounds of developmental edits. The one thing that was a little bit unusual with this project was I worked with 2 different editors. The editor who acquired the novel, Ruta Remus, relocated to a different publisher during the middle of the process. And that could have been really disruptive. And it was certainly sad because I'd worked with her on my previous 2 books and I love her. So I was very sad to lose her. But fortunately, her assistant was an assistant editor at the time. So she was beginning to acquire her own projects. And so she was able to take over my book. And so Nicole Fiorica then did the second round of developmental edits through publication with me. And it was really smooth because she'd already been with the book from the beginning and had been looped in on everything that had happened editorially and in all other parts of the process so far. So it wasn't quite like just a new editor coming in fresh. So it was a pretty seamless process in terms of how changing editors might be. And so there were certainly changes to the book, as always happens during developmental edits, but there was nothing sweeping. It was more building out elements that already existed in the book. Got a little longer in revisions, fleshing out scenes. I think we added maybe 1 or 2 chapters near the end to make the conclusion more robust. But it was a fairly streamlined editorial process without anything major. And yeah, I wish every book was this was sort of smooth in its in how it proceeds from first draft to finished book. But I got lucky with this one.
Yeah, like it sounds like it was really lucky and like really quite an easy sort of like thing for you to write in a way. I guess like you were so sort of like submerged in this world for this book, and like just it was so lucky as well that you wrote that draft when you did. I couldn't believe it when you said that, but yeah, right. I guess it just shows like how quickly you can be expected to turn around a draft as well in this industry.
I mean, clearly, if I had not completed writing the draft, I would have said, no, I need an extension, and it would have, we would have adjusted that in the contract. But yeah, I mean, I think because I had those really concrete touchstones for this book, since the inspiration was coming from these really tangible things for me and things that I was very interested in. Like I really wanted to write this podcast script and I really wanted to write this twist on an updated YA Rebecca. The book is by no means a straight retelling of Rebecca. It's more like if you've read Rebecca, you will find Easter eggs throughout and little bits that will connect to that, this character, this plot point, that sort of thing. But the story really takes its own plot direction and it's not a retelling. But because I love Rebecca, I was I felt very centered from the beginning of the writing process, which is not always the case.
Yeah, no, definitely. So Jayme, well, as Kit has talked to us a bit about the sort of like writing process and sort of getting it through acquisitions, would you be able to talk us through the audio production process, sort of like in general, like how it works, who else is involved?
I'm fascinated to hear this also because I feel like this is a learning experience for me too. Because as we've established, authors, unless the author is doing the narration, there's not really past the point of casting. There's not really that much involvement for the author. So, and I'm sure this was a particularly unusual process because of the full cast and because of the pandemic. We probably weren't able to do things in exactly the way they might have otherwise unfolded.
Yeah, I mean, it depends. You know, there was already a lot of home record happening in our industry before the pandemic started. So I feel like how I went through the process is probably about the same as how I would have gone through the process before the pandemic. But I can talk a little bit about what I can assume the production process was like, because as one narrator in this little cog in the machine, I had my sections, which I prepped and narrated, and then everybody else had theirs. And I actually just started listening to the audiobook over the weekend to prepare for this because I haven't heard it. I haven't heard the fully produced thing yet. I haven't heard the podcast. And I will say that most audiobooks that have some sort of like podcast or conversational element, they aren't produced as well as this podcast was produced. This was produced like an actual podcast. There's music. They put sound effects on people to sound like they were bad recordings or phone recordings. That element of this audiobook, I think, makes it a really special audiobook and unusual in the industry how much care was taken with the podcast portion of this audiobook. The other stuff, the stuff that I was narrating and Jenny was narrating, was pretty normal and straightforward, where we just read our chapters. I can't remember if I talked with anybody about what I was doing versus what they were doing. I definitely didn't talk with anybody on the podcast because I don't think I had anything to do with those characters. I might have written Jenny and Inez, but I don't think I did. I think I listened to samples of them on Audible and just figured that like their characters were going to sound kind of like them. And then taking into consideration more the attitudinal stuff that Kit gives in the book about what these people are like, I'm less worried about my character voice 100% matching another actor's version of that character. I think that listeners go, that's Jayme's version, and that's Jenny's version. I think listeners know to do that. As long as it's not wildly off base, as long as it's not like I'm giving a accent to somebody who doesn't have an accent in the book and then they don't match. I'm going to, try to make sure that my Martina sounds like Inez, which, Inez and I actually sound a little bit similar. So that wasn't too hard to do. So then just making sure that attitudinally I'm doing the best thing I can do for each character so that it feels real and authentic.
Yeah, like that sort of answered one of the questions that I was going to sort of like go on to a bit later, because I was wondering whether like all of you narrators involved in the audiobook, whether you'd have a meeting sort of like together, all of you first of all, to sort of like talk about the different styles that you could narrate in. So yeah, that is just really informative because like as Kit was saying, as writers we don't sort of have this insight into this side of like the audiobook productions. So yeah, it's really fascinating just sort of like hearing the different things that do and that don't happen. And there's a lot of like areas that I wouldn't have even thought of really, that sort of are involved sort of quite directly in this.
Yeah. I mean, oftentimes narrators will send each other character samples. Like, here's my sample of this character, and we try to match it. But, at the end of the day, you get these samples and you're like, I still can't sound like you. I have to sound like me. So, as long as we're sort of like following the framework that the author laid out, and, a character who is snooty sounds snooty, and a character who sounds insecure, like my version of that and someone else's version of that should echo each other enough that a listener feels like they make sense.
Yeah, totally. And the characters in this book are just so wonderfully complex, like especially these teenage girls that you've written, Kit. So I'd love to talk a bit more about sort of like characterization, how you went about creating like such complex characters, and like how you also like made some of them like unreliable as well, because I'm just like a sucker for an unreliable character, and this book was just perfect for that. Because like as I was saying earlier, every time when I thought I knew what was happening, like the next page would just like throw me completely off with like this amazing twist. So yeah, have you got any sort of tips that you can share on how you created these amazing characters?
Thank you so much. I love creating complex girls, especially. It's my jam. I think that's the one sort of through line with all of my YA thrillers. They're always going to be complex girls with complicated relationships. So the two central female characters, Anna and Martina, I was interested in their relationship because they're kind of unlikely allies in that Anna, this is not a spoiler, it happens in the first chapter, Anna walks into the police station in Heron Mills, this town where she is nannying for the summer, and confesses to playing a role in the murder of Zoe Spanos, who has been missing for several months. And so Martina's character, she is the best friend of Zoe's little sister, Aster. And so her character developed largely through, I needed a character who would be driven to do her own investigation into Zoe's disappearance, and then we learn murder. And it made sense to me that it would be someone close to the family, someone who wanted to get justice for the family, the sister's best friend. And so Martina, her primary goal is to solve this case, obviously. And that is whether or not it ends up benefiting Anna. Anna is incarcerated in juvenile detention, awaiting the trial. The book takes place in two separate timelines. So we get that first chapter where she walks into the police station to confess. That is the beginning of the present timeline, which takes place mostly during the fall while she's incarcerated and she's awaiting trial. And then the book flashes back to the start of the summer when Anna has just arrived in Heron Mills and she's here to nanny. So Martina's alliance with Anna, she interviews her, she includes Anna's story in the podcast. It's largely predicated on the fact that Martina doesn't really believe Anna, which gets to your question about unreliability. Anna opens with this confession saying that she played a role in Zoe's death, but there's a lot that Anna doesn't remember about that night. She has these snatches of memory that she's been working through all summer, and we get them spooled out throughout the past timeline. And by the time she steps into the police station, she has convinced herself, whether it's true or not, the reader doesn't know, but she has convinced herself that she was there the night that Zoe died and that she's at least in part responsible for Zoe's death. So I think that what I drew on in terms of creating Anna's unreliability and what I hope is a convincing way for the reader, it has a lot to do with the fact that Anna herself doesn't know the truth. So I think that I also love unreliable narrators. They can be really tricky because you withhold too much from the reader in ways that are not justified by the character. That's, I think, when readers get really frustrated with an unreliable narrator. If you feel as a reader you're just being lied to or tricked, it gets really, it's a frustrating experience because the book has not done the appropriate work to justify why information is being withheld. So with Anna, it was important to me that she's not ever lying to the reader. If she's withholding information, it's because that information is withheld from herself. She's completely reliable in terms of what she conveys to you, the reader. It's her memory that is unreliable, and she herself is working out what happened that night and the truth. So I think in terms of tips, if there's anyone watching that is working on or thinking about working on an unreliable narrator, I would say that it doesn't have to be memory, certainly. There are various reasons that a narrator can be unreliable, but whatever it is that makes that character unreliable, it has to be something that can be 100% justified in terms of what the character is presenting and not presenting to the reader. You, I think, get into sticky territory when a character is holding information back for the sole purpose that it's going to advance the plot in the way that the author wants the plot to advance. Then it starts to feel like reader manipulation in a way that readers will absolutely like glom onto and like know that they're being manipulated. So yeah, I think that would be my best piece of advice. And I can't say I've done it 100% successfully, but that's always what I'm thinking about when I'm developing someone that's unreliable like Anna.
Yeah, that's definitely such a valid point about it. It's quite a fine balance. You don't want to go too like one way or the other way. You've got to sort of like very much balance it carefully on that line. And yeah, I think you did it amazingly well, because like when I was listening to the audiobook, I kind of felt like I was listening to like this really intricate jigsaw like being put together piece by piece, and then like sometimes like it would suddenly be revealed that actually the piece that you just fitted was like slightly off, it didn't quite fit. And yeah, I just kept thinking about like this jigsaw analogy as I was listening to it, because I was just like blown away by sort of how masterful the whole thing was, like the way he sort of set out all these clues, and like the foreshadowing in this was just amazing. And yeah, I can't stop sort of like saying enough good things about it. It's honestly one of my favorite thrillers that I have read. So
thank you so much. I had a lot of fun creating all the little red herrings and clues throughout. And speaking of the revision process, getting back to an earlier question, I mean, that is something that definitely got fine-tuned and finessed through revision. There were some things that were planned, like I knew from the beginning that I would introduce a certain character at a certain point and that I wanted the reader to feel a certain way or think a certain thing about them. But often for me, when I am revising a thriller that has a mystery like this one does, it's in the revision process where those clues get really burnished in a way that they're probably either completely absent in the first draft, or they might be there, but they're not doing the work that they need to be doing yet. So that was certainly something that was sharpened through revision.
Yeah, definitely. That sounds really fascinating. And I love hearing about different authors' writing processes anyway. So, Jayme, I'm just wondering, sort of like, what are your thoughts about listening to the writing process as Kit is talking about this? Can you sort of like see any of it in the audio parts that you narrated? And I'm also wondering how important it is for you to like fully relate to characters that you're narrating.
So, I didn't narrate the whole book. So my experience is really that third person narrator, but hearing the way you talk about Kit, the way you talk about an unreliable narrator or protagonist, that was balanced out by people who didn't believe her or people who were still seeking the truth. So I don't think that you were with Anna all the time so that you would feel like you were being lied to or manipulated. I think maybe that's part of it, is that there was this balance of other people in the story trying to figure out what was going on and what had happened. And, that was my part of the story, was the let's figure this out, what happened. Sorry, Maddie, what was the second part of that question?
Like, is it important for you to be able to relate to the characters that you are narrating?
Yeah, I think I always feel best when I have a character who I relate to. I would say that I often get books that have like edgy or unlikable protagonists. That's sort of my specialty, is taking somebody who's like really sarcastic or got, kind of got like a chip on their shoulder and getting you to feel for them. And I guess that's sort of a piece of me. I don't think that I'm unlikable, but I don't think the first description anybody would ever use for me is like nice. Like, I think that kindness and niceness are two different things. So I think, there are some people who are really good at like naive. That's not going to be my thing. There are people who are really good at like, sweet. That's also not going to be my thing. So having characters who are like, all right, let's figure this out. What's going on here? And somebody who's like a little more like pushy, driven, that feels more my jam. Characters who are like, I don't have time for this. It's not my thing. Or like, yeah, okay, whatever. Like anybody who's got like a little bit of an edge to them, I feel like I'm going to be able to bring that to life in a really authentic way. And it makes me feel good. And anytime it feels too far away from who I am, I feel like I struggle. I feel like I end up like putting something on. It's like, be sweet. It's like, hi, I'm being sweet. And like, there are people who just ooze sweetness. And for me, it feels like this like mess that I'm trying to like get through that doesn't feel good. So yeah, I mean, look, everybody's different, but I feel like when it's whatever it is, it's acting. It's not like, I can't act. I can't do these. It's like, yeah, it's all acting, but something that feels, relatable helps you explore that piece of yourself versus something completely unrelatable, which makes you go, I don't know, I don't know how to connect with this piece.
Yeah, that makes sense. Probably thrillers are, I mean, there are certainly sweet and nice characters in thrillers, but probably in general, that's good connective territory for you.
Yeah, I've actually ended up doing a number of thrillers, which I never would have expected because, it's easy to think about genre before you think about character. So like, I was like, oh, why would I do thriller? Like, who would hire me to do thriller? And I've actually done a lot of them because there does end up being a lot of women in these stories who are, outsiders. And I'm like, oh, well, that's relatable to me. So yeah, I mean, there's always these women in these stories where like nobody believes them and they've got to fight for the truth. Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, that's me.
Yeah, and a lot of you had a kind of unique narration role because since you were doing this third person narration, it wasn't strictly one character. Like I believe you did the opening chapter where is that right? Where Anna's in the police.
Mm-hmm. And there's like a mostly being interrogated by a female police officer.
Right. And so you begin sort of in Anna's point of view, but from third person. And then you spend most of the time in Martina's point of view, third person. And Martina's a character where, like the police have come to one conclusion about this case. And so who's going to believe this high school girl who's producing a podcast out of her bedroom closet? So like she's a character that, ultimately is someone that you want to be on her side because she doesn't conduct a perfect investigation. She messes up. She she puts another character in a difficult position at one point. She's like, a 17-year-old girl who doesn't like do this perfectly, but ultimately she does a much better job than the police did. And so, so they're both she and Anna are characters that they're not unlikable. They both have an edge, though.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Anna, she's trying to run from her past a little bit. And I don't think that it's not that she's bad. It's just like, we're all trying to like be better versions of ourselves. She's not perfect. Right.
Who wants to read about perfect people?
No one wants to hear about perfect people. No, it's like we can idealize everything, but what's captivating is somebody, who's like, I've done a lot of bad stuff. This is my chance to reinvent myself. I mean, who didn't feel that way when they went to college? No one's going to know who I was in high school. I'm going to reinvent myself. And then you're just the same person all over again, So I think it's a totally relatable character.
Yeah. And did you find that when you were writing the characters in this book, that you had to be able to relate to them quite closely? Or is that something that doesn't sort of really factor into your creation of the characters?
I don't know that I have to relate to them closely, but I always need an entry point for a character, including my villains. And like, I don't want to write a villain that is just like a capital V villain. I need to find an entry point into those characters and their motivations as well. So, I don't think there's anyone in I Killed Zoe Spanos that I would describe as being like a highly autobiographical character in terms of who they are in relation to me. But there are pieces in every single central character in this book that I relate to.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. So we're coming up to the end of the time now. So is there anything else that either of you would like to say?
I just want to say how much I love this audiobook. Like, I'm a fan of this audiobook. I love that there are multiple narrators, and like Jayme was saying, the podcast production, in addition to just the fact that there were multiple people involved in doing the voices, is really, really high quality. And it is, as a podcast fan, when I heard how this all came together, I was just totally blown away. And so I love that, because I feel like I can recommend the audiobook without just like patting myself on the back, because there were so many people involved in this, from the cast to, I don't even know how many folks on the production end at SNS Audio had their hands in this, but I can only imagine, like, we're talking about a fairly significant team. And it's so nice as an author to be able to be like, you should check this out because it's really awesome, and feel like you're only one part of what contributed to that, in a way that I always feel a little bit weird doing promotion for just my book, because I'm just like, yeah, my book's great. But yeah, if you're interested in audiobooks, if you like podcasts, this is definitely one to listen to.
Yeah, I think that's kind of an amazing thing about shared art. Like, somebody might write a movie, but then you get a director and it's their interpretation of that script. And then you get actors and then it's their interpretation of those characters. And you watch it. And if somebody else was the director and somebody else was those characters, it would be a totally different experience. And it's the same thing with audiobooks. We've got this book, and then, somebody's producing it, and then people get put on it. And if it's not me and Jenny Barber and Inez, it's a different experience altogether. How I interpret Kit's writing is not going to be the same as some other narrator who gets cast as the third person section of this book. So, it's really nice for us to talk because, we were saying this before we started recording, like we've never talked to each other before. This is our first time meeting, talking about the book. And it's really nice to hear that an author liked it, like listening to it, because most of the time you do it and you're like, well, I guess I'll check the Audible reviews and see if people are happy with what I did. And also because I went back and started listening to the book, I wanted to remind myself what it was, and hear everybody else's work on it. I got to experience it in a new way as well. And also listening back to myself, I don't like hate my voice or love my voice. Most of the time when I'm listening back to myself, I just want to, assess, like, am I doing the things that I talk about, that I think about, that are important to me? And I was like, okay, like, you can tell the difference between my character voices. Like you can hear like that, oh, it's this person versus that person, but they don't sound like crazy. I'm always going for like subtle but distinct. And I'm like, okay, I felt pretty good about that. So it was like kind of good to listen back. It was cool to hear how the other actors interpreted things. For me personally, it was really cool to listen to Inez because I also have done a lot of coaching in audiobooks, and she's somebody who came to me for coaching a number of years ago, and I helped her I introduced her to the Simon & Schuster producers, and it was really great to hear her work in this book and be like, okay, she's like doing the things that I think about too. And like, that was just so awesome because, I help somebody, I send them off into the world, and then I don't hear their product either. So yeah, I really enjoyed listening to the audiobook, and it was, kind of great to circle back and hear the full thing because I was just a part of it.
Yeah, that sounds just amazing, especially when you're talking about your coaching as well, and like how sort of that sort of feeds back into projects that you then work on together later on.
I love that detail.
Yeah, that's just so cool. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us at YA Thrillercon today. So should we finish by just saying where the book can be bought and where the audiobook can be bought for viewers interested?
Sure. So if you go to just the main Simon & Schuster website at simonandschuster.com and put in I Killed Zoe Spanos in the search, they will have direct links to a bunch of retailer sites for all the different formats. So you can navigate directly to audio, and it'll take you to Audible and Google Play and all of the places where you can purchase the audiobook. And you can also go to the ebook cover and the paperback from there. So I think that's the easiest way. And of course, it's also available in library systems, love your local library. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you so much for organizing this. This was a lot of fun for me.
Thank you. This was so cool. It was great to meet you, Kit.
Yeah, you too, Jayme.